My name is John Marlin, and I'm a program manager on the High Availability and Storage team. I own the Failover clustering component, and this video series details many of the new features with Windows Server 2019 Failover clustering. In Part 5, we talked about scale-out file server, moving connections on Connect, cluster shared volumes, 1 gig cache as a default, secure SMB connections between the two, marginal disks where we'll start reacting to disks that are starting to go bad, and cluster aware updating. A couple of the new things with it. Testing without the need of an update to test with, as well as no rebooting if the update doesn't require a reboot. In Part 6, we're going to talk about the cluster network name and what we've done with it, some of the enhancements we made for running clusters in Azure, and domain migrations. First thing we want to talk about is the new cluster network name. It can now be a distributed network name, much like a scale-out file server. We added a new switch to the new cluster command dash management point network type with 3 options. Singleton, meaning it's going to be a traditional cluster with a network name and an IP address. Distributed, just like we did with scale-out file servers, it's just the network name and the IP addresses are tied to the nodes. And automatically detect if it's on-premises cluster or in Azure. Automatic is the default. Now, one of the reasons why you would use the cluster network name as a distributed name is in the cases where an IP address either isn't available or is not necessary. When you create a cluster through Cluster Manager, it will use the automatic selection. Are you on premise or are you in Azure? Now, for some of the Azure stuff, let's talk about some of what we did with it. As I previously talked about, when you create a cluster, we will detect if the creation is on an Azure IaaS virtual machine. During that detection, if it detects that it is in Azure, it will optimize all of the configurations so that it will run in Azure. There is a new property, Detected Cloud Platform, that will detect if it's in Azure, it will say Azure. If it is not in Azure, it will say none. One note about this that I've been asked before is this is only for Azure. It's not for some of the other cloud providers that are out there. At this point in time, we do not have anything for that. So it will detect it as a normal on-premise, so it'll give you the IP address option. If it is in Azure, as I mentioned previously, it will automatically create the distributed network name as the cluster name. What this means is, for clusters in Azure, there is no longer the need for the internal load balancer IP address to connect to the cluster. As a side note, any roles that are required that require network names will still need this internal load balancer created. This is only for the cluster name. And we do have some more stuff for Azure. One of the key things, we did add integration and awareness for Azure host maintenance. Hosts, like any hosts on premises, do require maintenance from time to time. Whenever host maintenance is needed, generally everything that's on the particular host will get moved off. Now in Azure, that's not always the case. It all depends on what the particular maintenance is. So for example, if they were going to do a real quick maintenance that only takes, say, 20-30 seconds, something like that, then what the Azure team may do is simply freeze the VM. In other words, it may take hours to move everything off for a 20-second maintenance period. So they may just freeze the VMs. All the VMs must be in the same Azure availability zone. We have improved the experience by monitoring now for any of the Azure host scheduled events. And what this is going to do is help troubleshoot hangs and disconnects much easier to detect. If you've ever troubleshot clusters in a Azure environment, at times you may lose network connectivity between the nodes, and it's very possible it's due to Azure host maintenance. If a node is frozen, heartbeats can't get through. Heartbeats cannot get through. That could indicate the node may be down, so we react accordingly. This will make it much easier. Now, when we're talking about host maintenance and what we're detecting, we're actually going to start logging events. Here's an example of one of the events, and it will be in the Failover cluster operational log. Node maintenance is detected. Cluster service detected a Azure host maintenance event has been scheduled. This maintenance may cause the node hosting the virtual machine to become unavailable at this time. We also give a description about what's going to happen. It is a scheduled event, and what they're going to do is freeze the machine. So it may be down for a quick period of time. Like I said, it might be 20 or 30 seconds. It might be a little more. It depends on what the maintenance is. But now we are actually bubbling these events up into the virtual machines in Azure. That is a good thing. This is going to help troubleshoot some of those odd scenarios where a cluster may drop out of membership. Someone is connecting and it's hung and they're no longer able to connect for a brief period of time. Now there are a couple of events besides the scheduled. 1136 is it's imminent and fixing to occur. The 1139, which I showed previously, that maintenance has been detected, that means it's gotten onto the schedule. And then the last one, node maintenance has been rescheduled, so it's not going to actually do the maintenance at the time a decision was made to reschedule it for a different time. There is a cluster property that you can now control based off of the event. What do you want to do? If you are on premises, that is a 0. Obviously it's on premises, it's not in Azure, so there's not going to be events, so we're not going to log anything. If you are in Azure, part of the detection and optimization that we will do is to log those scheduled events. There's additional options here to avoid placement. If there is if we detect that a host is scheduled to be under host maintenance, then do not move any roles to this node. Now, that is any new roles. If there's already a role, that role will continue to stay on the node. You can do number 3. which is to pause and drain the node when the scheduled event is detected. Let it move everything off for you so that if there is the host maintenance that happens, your productivity isn't down, even slightly. Or 4, pause, drain, and fail it back. Same thing. We detect it, we pause the node, move all the roles off, but we will actually fail it back to the node when that scheduled event is concluded. Again, this is a very good thing. There's also a detect manage events threshold. Default is 60, so if we detect it's fixing to happen, let's react to it now, move everything off. You can change it to a higher level or a lower level, all up to you. And like I said, it is basically the amount of time before it is to occur for you to move it off. Domain migrations. This is something that has been I won't say it's been a thorn in the side of a lot of people who deal with clusters, but in some cases it can be. One company purchases another and it needs to integrate all of the previous company's clusters into your domain. If for times where you create a cluster at your main office for a remote site, the domains may not necessarily be the same. There's a few other examples similar to this. So when talking about migrating a cluster from one domain to another, it's in essence, back up your data, remove the cluster, destroy the cluster in essence, change the machines to the new domain, recreate your cluster, recreate your resources, restore your data if necessary. It is a destructive process. This has been the thorn that everybody's always had and always haven't liked. But that's no longer the case with Windows 2019. Now you can simply move clusters from one domain to the other with simply a PowerShell command. Or commands, I should say. It has the ability to dynamically change network names AD integration. So you can run a PowerShell command to change it from a domain to a work group. When you change it from a domain to a work group, it will remove the objects from AD, from the previous AD. Treat it like a normal work group cluster at that point. An additional PowerShell command gives the ability to dynamically change it from a work group to a domain. All while the cluster remains intact, roles remain intact. You're just simply dynamically changing it. When you're changing it from a work group to the new domain, it will go and create your new network names. There is some downtime attributed to this, as the network names have to be offline, which means your roles have to be offline. But so there is a little bit of a maintenance period that would need to be scheduled, but you're not having to destroy the cluster. So to wrap this up, we talked about the new cluster network name. It can now be a distinguished name so that no cluster IP is required. In an Azure scenario, no more internal load balancer IP address will need to be created to connect to the cluster. Some of the enhancements for Azure, we're detecting this in Azure. We're logging events. We can react to the scheduled host events that are there. And then domain migrations. Move it from one domain to the other while keeping your cluster intact. The next video in the series is we're going to relive a couple of the Ignite 2018 announcements. Big announcements from an S2D standpoint. I thank you for watching this video.